Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big welcome to Dr. Genevieve Bell.
It is my pleasure to be here. I can't imagine a more exciting place to be or a better audience. I also can't imagine beginning any presentation by an Intel executive without a legal disclaimer. This is just to make sure you are paying attention. This should remind you should make no trading bets based on what I am going to tell you. And that really you can hold us accountable for almost nothing. Okay, so you've all internalized this, right? When my lawyers ask, you saw the legal disclaimer? Yes, good. Now, when Bill and the committee approached me and asked me to come and give this keynote, I did initially ask why on earth they thought I was an appropriate person. They made me promise that I wouldn't talk about Intel, which was a good call, and that I should not actually show our roadmap or talk about our extraordinary products. And I have to apologize, Bill, I lied to you when I said yes to that. Because what I do want to say is that we have an amazing booth. There we go. In the room, there are Intel people. Will you all stand up? Come on, I know you know who you are. Stand up. All right. When you go upstairs to booth 2701, all these incredibly able people will tell you about all of our amazing stuff. They will show you great things. There are extraordinary pieces of technology and stories and partnerships on display, and I encourage you all to go there at once, but not before I've finished speaking. And with that, I want to change gears and talk about the secret life of data. And I thought I'd start with a sheep, because sheep are funny. And I figured you might all need a small laugh at 8:30, nearly 9 o'clock in the morning. But really this is here because when I was thinking about data and the secrets that data keeps, I wanted to think about what are the unexpected ways in which data is being used and has been used to create new things, new knowledge, even new life. And when you think about that, it's hard not to think about Dolly the sheep, and about notions of cloning and genetics, and about how far data has advanced our ability to talk about what's possible. And, you know, a sheep is an interesting way to think about data, right? But I realized it was me, and I didn't really want to talk about sheep. I wanted to take a slightly different tact. What I wanted to ask instead was this notion of, is everything data? And if it is, how do we know what's data and what isn't? And what's the role of technology in all of that? And I wanted to start with this pixelated image here, which I know looks like graffiti and looks like a data stream and possibly a visualization, but to the right eye, it's actually data. This is the wall of a shearing shed in my hometown. See, the sheep are going to keep coming back. This is a shearing shed in my hometown. This is an active shearing shed. It's been active for nearly 120 years. Every season when people come and shear the sheep, they leave their names on the wall. So if you know how to read this wall, you know how to read who's shorn here for the last 120 years. You can read the boom years and the bust years because there are more stenciled names, there are more tallies associated with them. You can tell the families that have been and gone in this town. You can tell where the best shearers came from and what families were persistent, right? You can see all kinds of things here if you know what to look for. And it made me think about data and the notion of big data and the stories it can tell if you know what you're looking for. And what I really wanted to do for the next little while is tell you some of those stories about data, and to think about the fact that sometimes data is in the eye of the beholder, not just in the machine that stores it. But I realized that means you also need to know a little bit about me. That was an extraordinarily gracious and somewhat daunting video of me, but there are some other things you need to know because they'll help you make sense of what I'm about to tell you. You will have already heard from my accent, I'm Australian. This is good. I know there are Australians in the room. I came to your booth last night and you weren't there. I was very sad. I took away some of your literature, though, so thank you for that. I'm going to assemble my fold-up kangaroo later. So I grew up in Australia, and I'm the daughter of an anthropologist. So I'm an anthropologist myself. I'm the daughter of an anthropologist. I grew up on my mother's field sites in central and northern Australia in the 1970s and 1980s. That meant I spent most of my early childhood with Indigenous people who remembered their country before Europeans came, who remembered what their country was like before cattle and fences, and who, at the drop of a hat, would take my younger brother and I hunting with them. So I spent most of the time you were learning more important things. I was running around with no shoes, speaking another language, and killing anything within a reasonable range of me. Not for fun, I hasten to add, but for supper. So, you know, should you ever decide that you need someone who knows how to kill small lizards, I am your girl. If you also want to know how to get water out of frogs, I'm that person too. Not usually something you need to worry about in Portland or I suspect in Denver, where there seem to be a lot of restaurants who might provide you with water, but were you in a desert dying of thirst, I know how to get the water out of the frog that will save you. So again, good person to have on your side. You may wonder with a biography like that how I ended up at Intel. This is not a story I'm allowed to tell on stage. It involves a man in a bar in Palo Alto and beer. So you should catch me afterwards and I may be willing to tell you just a little bit of how that came to be. Because truthfully, if you're a professor at Stanford, Intel is a kind of a stretch as an anthropologist. So I know you're then thinking, wait, she said she was an anthropologist and she's at Intel? Really? And the answer is yes. In fact, we have lots of anthropologists at Intel. By lots, I mean at least more than one. Which for anthropologists, that's a lot at a large technology company. We also have sociologists and cognitive psychologists, linguists. I even have an economist on my team who's lovely. And our job there is really to think about people. How do we bring what people care about, what frustrates them, what they love, what they hope for themselves, their families, their communities? How do we bring that into the business of making technology? How do we use what it is that human beings care about and drive those insights into product and technology innovation? So ultimately, my job and the job of my whole team is to put people back into the process by which technology is made, to basically bring the human element into the conversation. And that's what I want to do here with big data. Because it's reasonable to ask the question, okay, that's all very well and good, but what would an anthropologist have to say about big data? And I wanted to talk about big data for you and for this conference because I think of it as being one of the things that is the most interesting challenge in the next sort of 10 years for all of us, right? It's interesting from a social science and regulatory point of view, but it's also interesting from a technical point of view about how are we going to make sense of, manage, use, store, retrieve, and access these increasingly large data sets. But for me, it's also important about how we put people into that story, right? What does it mean to think about all of that and what might it look like? So I wanted to tell you a story. And all good stories at Intel start with Andy Grove. But I actually wanted to go back further than that. I wanted to go back nearly 1,000 years. So for those of you who were not paying attention in high school history, I'm going to make that all up for you right now. So, and if those of you who really didn't pay attention in high school history because you didn't like it, tough. You're going to get caught up now too. So here we go. We're going to go back to 1028 AD. So like a long time ago, nearly 1,000 years ago. And there was a young man coming of age in Normandy, in what we would now call France. His name was William. This is the closest representation we have of him. His parents were not married, so he went by the unfortunate sobriquet of William the Bastard for most of his life. I think it's safe to say it left him with a fairly substantial chip on his shoulder. He wanted to prove who he was. He inherited a fairly complicated kingdom in Normandy that was beset by many challenges. He also inherited it when he was 10. This big. Not a good time to inherit a kingdom and work out what the hell to do with it. So he spends most of his 20s and his 30s trying to stabilize his kingdom, make a name for himself, which he does. He also turns out, and this is kind of important in this time period, he turns out to be quite tall for the time. If you look at archaeological records, William was probably 5'10", 5'11". Doesn't sound like much now, but in a time when everyone was about 5'3", he was spectacular. And you put him in armor and you stick him on a horse, he must truly have been quite something else again. He would have been hard to miss. And he was an excellent horseman, he was an extraordinary warrior, and he basically trampled all over most of France and increased his kingdom not inconsiderably. 20s and 30s passed thus. You know, basically romping around on a horse with a sword, making himself in charge of things. Not a bad life. He did reasonably well. He survived into his 40s, which is kind of extraordinary in this period of time. Also because of the vagaries of British and French genealogical systems, which I will not bore you with, he becomes a contender for the throne of England. A distant one, but a contender nonetheless. And in a time period where kingdoms didn't pass necessarily from father to son, they sometimes passed to whoever was standing around and could win the next fight, he becomes an important player in thinking about the future of England. And for those of us who grew up in the British Commonwealth, for those of you who grew up in England, for those of you who have any passing date in history, this next date will not be a surprise to you. Because in 1086 AD, something really spectacular happens. Turns out the King of England, at that point, a nice man named Edward, dies. Edward the Confessor. He dies. Although he has appointed William as his logical successor, owing again to court politics, and there were a lot of court politics at this point, let me tell you, an enormous amount of court politics, a man named Harold becomes king instead. Now, Harold, complicatedly, is William's brother-in-law, so not really the obvious successor to the throne, but he's standing around, and Harold's kind of hard to ignore also. He is also tall, he's also kind of belligerent. He is closer at home, and he has a sword and an army, and he says, right, you're dead, I'm king. And everyone went, all right, very good then, and made him king. So he becomes king of England. William, on the other hand, still William the Bastard, sometimes William of Normandy, figures he can do better than Harold. So he summons up all of the boats he can find, which is a not inconsiderable number of boats. We're talking somewhere about 300 boats. He gets all the men he can find who have horses and bows and arrows. We're talking about 5,000 of them, and he puts them on the boats and he takes them across from Calais to Britain. Amazingly, this took less than a day. He arrives early, so he needs to put his boats in the water. He leaves them basically offshore for 3 hours until dawn happens. Think of this as like being the moment when you arrive at an airport and they say, due to your unexpected early arrival, the gate is not ready. That moment, but in 1066 AD. So the boats wait in the water till finally dawn arises. They disembark the horses, they disembark the army, and they start marching towards a place called Hastings. Now, what William didn't know, because of when he crossed the Channel, and because truthfully in 1086 AD they didn't have the internet or mobile phones or even a telegraph system, he didn't realise that Harold had just been invaded from the other side. That basically the Danish and the Vikings had marched into England coming from the other direction. There'd been a huge battle at a place called Stamstead, and Edward had actually, Harold at this point had actually survived the battle, done very well for himself, is feeling pretty smug, and sends all his troops home to have, a bathe and some more food. So now he suddenly has an army coming in the other direction, and he's got nothing. So he summons his troops. They end up in a place called Hastings, and on October 14th, 1066 AD, William and Harold meet on the battlefield. And it is arguably an uneven battle. William is reasonably fresh, Harold has fought this big fight, William has a lot of people on ponies, Harold not so many, there are arrows involved. Those of you who know your military history know this is kind of a pivotal battle. William kills Harold, Harold dies with an arrow through his head, kind of an inglorious ending, and William is crowned King of England and stops becoming William the Bastard and suddenly becomes William the Conqueror, which is a better name to be known by, frankly, and one that he enjoyed for another 20 years. So he goes on to become the first Norman King of England, so the end of the Anglo-Saxons, beginning of the Normans, so less speaking English, more speaking French and Latin, less kind of open land ownership, more feudal system. So many transformations are now wrought when William turns up. And his first 20 years of leadership are kind of complicated, right? First 20 years, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of churn and thrash. There is radical cultural transformation. The ruling classes suddenly become Norman lords, not English lords. There are transformations in how the church is treated. There is a lot going on. And it goes on and on and on for 20 years of this. And, William's getting older. Other people around Europe go, he's in his 50s now. Bet he's vulnerable if we threaten to invade. And so the invasions start, waves come again, right? And in 1085, the Danes go, right, we're coming to get you. You're old. We don't believe that you can hold this land anymore. We have a big army. We're on our way. This is not good news if you're a king, right? You're like, oh, damn. So, Christmas in Gloucester, William brings all of his troops together, all of his generals, and he's like, okay, listen, basically, gentlemen, we have a problem. We have an invading army and we've got nothing. And so he says, I think we probably need to work out what is actually at our disposal. We need to have a full survey of all that is England and all that is basically, in William's mind, all that is mine. I want to know who's there, who occupies it, and what they basically have at their disposal. Because he needs to raise an army, and he probably also, parenthetically, needs to raise taxes. So he does this amazing thing, right? So again, we're talking 1085 AD. So let us remember, no motorized transportation, no electronic communication forms, no telephones. Not actually a lot of paper, turns out. Paper was hard to come by too. There's a lot of sheep that we turn into things onto which to write. There's a lot of goose who don't have so many tail feathers anymore because we turn them into quills. But there's not a lot of technology at your disposal. But nonetheless, he says, I'm going to survey my whole kingdom. And he sends out a written questionnaire. It's classic, right? He sends it out to every lord. And the questionnaire says things like, what's your name? What's the name of your land? How many people are on it? How many of those people are free men? How many of those people are serfs or slaves? How many cows do you have? How many sheep do you have? How many chickens do you have? And the list goes on, right? It's like a 3-page questionnaire. And the questionnaires get sent back to the scribes and the monks and the bureaucrats. And that's all good. There's a lot of it. It takes about 7 months. Ultimately, they survey 13,000 settlements, which is kind of an extraordinary number. Now, unsurprisingly, because this is 1086 AD at this point, there are some things that are missing. There are no women in this survey. It doesn't occur to anyone to ask about women. This seems to be a common problem. Not just in 1086 AD, but possibly continuing forward after that. So they don't include any women, they don't include any children, they don't include most of the church. There are some people who don't answer, so they're also missing. And surprisingly, if you think about this period of time, they also don't survey London or Winchester, which are the two biggest, basically, settlements in England. But because they don't have anyone in charge of them, there's no one they can really ask the question of. So this entire survey happens absent those two big cities. So then what happens? Well, so now you have this whole survey. And everyone goes, okay, very good then. We've got a survey, but we don't entirely believe that you've told the truth, which is probably sensible. Any of you who've ever filled in a questionnaire know that you don't always tell the exact truth when asked the question. And so the king says, it's all very well and good that you've told me how much you have, but now I want you to prove it. And he summons some of his royals, some priests, some local Englishmen, and he sends them out to each district in England with the questionnaires in hand and holds a court. Like a legal court, and says, right, you said you had 27 sheep and half an acre. Prove it. And so now there is this incredible court, right, where everyone has to prove what they have, that they are who they say they are, and that the land is theirs, and that those are indeed their lambs and cows and chickens and rivers. Unsurprisingly, this is not a popular moment. There are fights, there is bloodshed, there is open, like, really pissiness in all of these jury meetings, where people are going, well, I know he says that, but those are my sheep, not his sheep. He says he's in charge, but really the land was given to me, and here's some like vague document I have to prove it. Many fights. Takes months to resolve all of this. But ultimately, as they go county by county, circuit district by circuit district, these documents get composed, right, that become the Winchester roll or the king's roll. They become a roll of everyone who reports to the king and every piece of property they have. For the English nobles and the Norman lords, the day that the circuit court decides in each one of those districts is cynically referred to, in colloquial English, as the day of judgment. They're referring to the Bible, right? The day when God sorts you out. You're going to heaven or you're going to hell. And in this case, it was the king sorting you out. Will you have land or won't you? Unsurprisingly, that was a kind of difficult moment, right? Because a whole lot of people became owners of things and became responsible for things and also became responsible for providing the king for things. Provide me, if this is your land, I need your men. If that's the size of your property, I want your taxes. The roll also created whole new ways of thinking about England. It created manors, which hadn't existed before, so M-A-N-O-R-S. I know I have an odd accent. But it created a category of land ownership and of land holders that wasn't geographic, it was effectively by person. Were you in charge of something? It didn't matter where you were, it mattered who you were. It's this extraordinary thing, right? And you all know this document. We all know this book, because this is the Doomsday Book. This is the Book of Judgment. This is the book that set down in history in 1086 AD the scope and size of England. It was ultimately, of course, not one book, it's two books. It's always good when even the name isn't right. There's actually two books here. It took 900 sheep to make all the pages of these two books. Extraneous data, but everyone should know it. It was, of course, out of date as soon as it was finished, because if you're going to survey everything, people will have died sometime in 1085 AD that are still on the roll in 1086 AD. But unlike many things, it was built to last forever. It was built to be the record of England in perpetuity. Now, William, whose vision this is, whose willpower executes it, dies in 1087 AD. So he never lives to see this document in its full glory or in its full scope. But for the next 200 years, the Doomsday Book was taken by the English court everywhere they held court. So every time there was a meeting of the court, the Doomsday Book was produced, and if you turned up to have a complaint or to make a request to marry someone or to make a behest about land ownership, this book was dragged out of its very large case and consulted. And it was like, okay, are you the descendant of this person here? Do you still have this many pieces of land? Where are your sheep? It shaped English life, arguably for 500 years. It became the tax base. It became the base of land tenure systems, of organization. It shaped the relationship between the monarch and citizens. It was last consulted for legal reasons in a court case in 1960. So this is a book that has been valid effectively for 1,000 years. You can still go visit it. You could visit it online right now, although I would hasten to suggest you shouldn't. But you can visit it online. It's been online since 2006. And you can go and visit the physical object in the National Archive in Kew in London. And the amazing thing about it is it's still accessible. Granted, it's in Latin, and not so many of us read Latin. I did Latin in high school, so I have a standing chance of being able to read some of this. But think about everything most of us in this room produce. What are the chances that the technologies we are using now, the technologies on which we are storing data, will be good in 1,000 years? I learned to program with punch cards because I'm old. Guarantee a punch card is not going to be useful 1,000 years from now if anyone could actually find a way to read it. Chances are it's not going to have the same kind of stand. Think, I know, what's a punch card? Small square thing, holes, punch card. Think magnetic tape, think disks, think floppy disks. Think all manner of solid-state drives that we have now. Chances that we're going to be able to use those in 1,000 years? I don't think they're fabulous. Chances that the data set that is stored on those devices will still be relevant in 1,000 years is a really interesting and remarkable challenge, right? Are you making something that is going to be good for 1,000 years? Will it shape and change the way we think about who we are, how we organize ourselves, how we make sense of what we are doing? It's a kind of extraordinary proposition, right, and a challenge. So why am I telling you all of that? You slept through it in high school, why am I telling it to you now, right? Well, there's a couple of things about what the Doomsday Book is and what it stands for. And I think it is an extraordinary example of big data before computation. Computers didn't invent big data, humans did. We've had data sets that we use to make decisions and mechanisms for thinking about it for a very long time. Long before the Doomsday Book, in China, there was an early census, probably in about 600 BC. There were a series of Roman maps for thinking about roads that predate these two as well. So we've had mechanisms for thinking about large data sets for a really long time. But there's something about the Doomsday Book that for me was really useful, because let me think about the three things that I think make up big data. First thing is there's the survey itself, right? Which is the data, it's the facts. There's the Winchester roll, the actual document, which is a framework, right? Because they didn't just write down the survey results, they reorganized them, they restructured them, they made sense of them, they corrected them. They, of course, added errors in quite spectacularly, because the Greater Doomsday Book was all edited by one scribe who I think might have been mildly dyslexic because he wasn't good with Roman numerals. He spent a lot of time inverting them, which creates interesting problems over time. And then last but by no means, there was the judgment, right? There was the tax base, there was the army raising on top of it. So there was a mechanism for extracting value from the data. It wasn't just about writing it down. It was about doing something with it. And of course, we know big data is just like this, right? Big data is about the data or the facts. It's about the framework, which is analytics and visualizations. And ultimately, it's about how we extract value, which is algorithms. So in some ways, the Doomsday Book is a perfect piece of big data long before there was computing involved. But of course, there is computing involved, and that changes everything, right? That changes the scale of things. Big data today, on a scale that we couldn't possibly have imagined, William the Conqueror couldn't have dreamed of, right? It is extraordinary in its scope and scale. It's also messy, not unlike the Doomsday Book was messy, and it's messy because it starts with us. As soon as you get a human being in the equation, anywhere in the equation, we make mess. We create data, we understand it, we use it. Big data doesn't exist without us. But that means data, visualizations, and algorithms are all infinitely more complicated than they appear because there are people in the story. And I want to kind of tease that apart for you just briefly and give you some examples that mostly come from the kind of ethnographic, human-centered side of the equation. So the first thing is I said there were facts, right? And it's really easy to say facts speak for themselves. The reality is facts rarely speak for themselves, and facts are never straightforward. They're incredibly complicated. I would argue they're always partial. and always just a little bit not quite right. And from where I sit, there's a couple of reasons that's true. The number one thing is when you ask people about things to create facts, it turns out we lie all the time about everything. Average human being lies somewhere between 6 to 200 times a day. If you're on the 200 end, you are sociopathic, but 6 is pretty easy to get to. Did you like your breakfast? Did you sleep well? Did you think that was an interesting talk? You know all those lies. And it turns out they scale out, right? Some of them are really, really easy. My colleagues at Cornell University who work on this stuff will say that if you look at online dating sites in the United States, 100%, that's everyone, 100% of people admit to lying in their online dating profiles. Everyone. Which is amazing, because I don't think 100% of Americans do anything the same except this. And of course the reality is men and women lie about two completely different things. Most of you, that would be men, lie about your height. You claim you are 3 to 5 inches taller than you actually are, like we wouldn't notice. We, on the other hand, claim to be 5 pounds lighter. Now, of course, the useful thing about this is if 100% of people are lying, it's really easy to factor that in, right? You just factor in that all that data is invalid. Or all that data is just faintly problematic. It's much more complicated when only some people lie in a data set. My friends in the early days of MySpace were always astonished by the fact that 15% of their users were over the age of 100. Seemed improbable till you realized that when you signed on, you had to pick a date of birth, and if you're under the age of 14, you weren't supposed to be on the site legally, so you picked a date of birth that made sure you were over the age of 14, and you just picked the first one, which turned out to be like 1900. So, we have the problem of lies, right, of self-reporting and all the issues attendant with it. We also have the challenge of data comes with responsibilities, right? Not all data is generated in the same moment. When I was growing up, the communities I lived in, Aboriginal people would say you had the responsibility to tell a story right. So the stories of their country, the stories of their land, the stories of how they came to be there, those were stories that you had a responsibility for. You witnessed them. If they told you that story, you were responsible for telling that story again and telling it properly. On a more kind of pragmatic basis, we know that's true about medical data in the United States. Think of the HIPAA provisions. That means that certain data can't travel. If you are a custodian of that data, you have to keep it under certain kind of security protocols. Data just doesn't move freely, or at least some data is locked down in certain kinds of ways. Data sets are also complicated because they sometimes exist in relationship to other pieces of data you don't always know about. Were you to go to India at the moment, you would discover a country that has nearly 850 million mobile phones, biggest mobile phone base in the world, fastest ramp in the world too, went from 10 million 10 years ago to 850 million mobile now, kind of astonishing. Mostly not smartphones, or at least not on a smart network, so no really strong 3G and 4G presence across the whole country. But if you look at any single person's phone, you will find it is full of media content. And the challenge becomes, where do they get that? And if you ask people, they'll tell you. Go to a train station and there's a man in a stand who is called the media man. Take him your phone, give him your money, and he'll give you media. It turns out this is exactly right. You go there, you give your phone to the bloke. He says, weekend or weekday? Interesting question. Until you realize that there is the content that you would commute on a train with versus the content you might hang out on a weekend with. They all involve cricket, but some of them involve music videos and the others don't. And you give your phone to him, he puts the content on, he erases the old content, you come back on a Friday, he takes that content off, he puts new content on. Perfectly seamless system, right? Now, if you want to work out who consumes what content in India, you have a problem. Because if you go to the media man and you look at his data stream, it suggests that he likes everything from romantic comedies to Bollywood to cricket to news. Because he is not a single data point, right? He is actually a data point composed of many data points. So how you learn to think about what a single data point is and what's nested inside of it, intensely complicated, right? How you start to think about the fact that what appears to be one data point is actually a set of nested and related data points, really messy. And then last but no means least, at least I think when I think about this stuff, is the notion of power, hugely important in how we think about data. Think about the Doomsday Book. If you've got the king's man standing in front of you going, how many sheep do you have? And he's got a sword on his waistband, you might tell him something different than if there is the priest or the scribe standing there going, how many sheep do you have? Because there's something about the sword and the relationship that it encodes that makes you think differently about how you choose to answer. Data that's collected under certain kind of circumstances carries that with it too. But we also know over the last 6 months that we are having a very different conversation about data than we were at the beginning of the year. We're now having a conversation about where do governments sit, what is the role of the nation state, what is the role of agencies, what is the role of privacy, of security, how are those things encoded at a national level and an international level, and what does it mean to start to think about data that may not move, data that needs to stay in a particular place or in a particular server or in a particular space. It's very different than we have historically thought about it. So facts, not as straightforward as they appear, mostly because there are people in the equation. It's also the case that visualizations are a little complicated too. So even if you resolve the issues with facts, facts don't always speak for themselves. You have to find new ways of presenting facts, new ways of thinking about them. This map here is effectively the first data visualization. There are many others, but I think this is the one that is probably the most significant, because actually this particular map here changes everything for every one of us in this room today. And it comes from 1854. This was a map of a street in London. So in 1854, in September, there was a cholera outbreak in Soho in London. Cholera had come to Europe at the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries. It was deadly. It has an incredibly high mortality rate. It's incredibly infectious, and there were no known ways of treating it. And before we had a notion of germ theory and Pasteur thinking about how germs moved, the dominant theory for cholera was a theory called miasma. So it was smelly air, basically. If it smelt bad, that's what made you sick. You can imagine that then said that certain parts of certain cities were always seen as being more difficult than others. Those parts of those cities were not notionally usually poor. They were ethnic enclaves. There were all kinds of ways of saying if it didn't smell right, it was dangerous. The cholera outbreak starts on August 31st. In 1854, 2 days later, 150 people are dead on one street alone. 4 days later, 500 people are dead on that one street alone. But no one knew it. It's a man named John Snow, who was a medical doctor and an interesting thinker, who had a theory about cholera. He didn't think it was airborne, but he couldn't work out what it was borne. And there was a man named Reverend Henry Whitehead, who was the local parish priest for Soho and who was on Broad Street watching people die. And he and Snow ended up working together. And they realized that in order to understand what was happening, you didn't need to know when people died, you needed to know where they died. And no one had ever asked that question before. The death rolls in England at that point just went by date and type of death. So, August 31st, cholera. September 1st, more cholera. Cholera, but never with an address. And Whitehead came to Snow and said, I think they're dying on Broad Street more than anywhere else, because that's my local parish, and I know there are whole households of dead people. And Snow and Whitehead went, maybe we need to change the way we think about death. We need to map it onto place, not onto time. And when they did, it suddenly became clear in this map. You can see it. People weren't dying everywhere in Soho. They were just dying on Broad Street and a few little places around it. And the few little places around it all had something in common. They all used the pump on Broad Street for their water. And in that moment, it suddenly becomes clear to Snow, who is a physician, that what he is looking at is contamination by water, not by air. He couldn't prove it until he put the facts into a new framework. And the framework was a map, where he inverted time and space and made it into something different. This is the foundation of epidemiology. This is how we think about disease and how disease spreads. This map here, this data visualization, means that most of us in this room will never be subjected to cholera, and we won't die of it. And people haven't died of it in the same ways since. So there's something about how you visualize data that can make facts suddenly and abundantly clear. We also know there are challenges with not just visualizations, but how we make sense of the data. How do we decide what pieces of data to analyze and what to do with them? The notion of analytics, right? How do we shape how we see the facts? And there are lots of stories you can tell about analytics and about how we discover and communicate meaningful patterns. But ultimately, it's about how you decide which facts are relevant, right? What's the analytic framework you use to surface the facts you care about? There is a story that has always stuck with me about this, and it's one that comes from the scientific community. I'm sure some of you in the room know about it. From a man named Joseph Farman, who was someone who studied environmental science and atmospheric sciences, he was collecting atmospheric data from Haley Bay in Antarctica. He'd been doing it since 1957, so he's kind of committed, right? He's got one machine in Antarctica collecting atmospheric data. And every year, he sends his students down there, or people who are down there, collect the data, bring it back, he analyzes it. In 1982, so 25 years into the 30 years into the data being collected, his one data point for that year shows this extraordinary dip in the ozone layer. And he calls his mates at NASA, who are also tracking Antarctic data, and he says, listen, I've got this blip in my data, does your data show it? And he knows that they have satellite data over the Antarctic. He knows they collect their data 7 days a week, 365 days a year. They know they've got, a whole kind of thing that's going on there. And they say, no, we've got nothing. And he's like, all right, must just be the machine, I'll replace it. So he sends a new one down on the boat. When the new data comes back in 1983, it has the same problem as it did in 1982. And then he says, okay, maybe this isn't a machine. And he goes back and reanalyzes all of his data back to 57. And he discovers that starting in the 1970s, he actually sees something happening to the ozone. And the NASA guys are still going, nope, we got nothing. And so he publishes the data anyway, because he thinks what he's got is good. At which point, his colleagues at NASA discover they actually have the same data he has. It's just that they've been using a data processing program to manage the sheer scale of the data they were collecting. And in order to manage all that data, and effectively to create a data set you could manage, they had put parameters on the data. And the parameters were designed to keep any data that was in reasonable ozone activity and throw out anything that wasn't, on the basis that if it wasn't, clearly it was a machinery failure. And so they'd thrown out all the unreasonable ozone activity data. Hadn't actually thrown it out, which is good for all of us. They just put it to one side. And so now they've got Farman's paper, they have no choice but to go back and look. And of course, what becomes clear and what we all know now, sitting in 2013, is that the hole in the ozone did something really unexpected over Antarctica. It grew exponentially, not algorithmically. It expanded in a way no one had anticipated and no one had modeled. And the model that NASA built was a model based on what they knew up until then, and a model based on what it should do, not what it did do. And as a result, a whole lot of information disappeared, effectively. It just wasn't there. So one of the interesting challenges we have as we move from the facts, which are already partial, to the visualizations and the analytics is we start to encode logics. We encode ideas and assumptions and theories and hopes and ideologies and frameworks. And all of those mean that as we move further up this kind of stack of sense-making, what we are making sense of is often not entirely what is there. And the disconnect only gets more extreme. Of course, if you move from this to algorithms, so take visualizations and analytics, and now you go to algorithms, i.e. a way that we start to extract value, you can see that this problem only amplifies. You'll notice that I began this talk with a legal disclaimer. That legal disclaimer is also why you are not currently looking at a picture of Justin Bieber and Warren Buffett, but two people who look vaguely like them. So you should imagine these are my stand-ins for Justin Bieber and Warren Buffett. Because what is an algorithm ultimately, right? Well, it's a thing that helps us do more with data. You want to think it's about how we extract value out of data. Sometimes it's monetary, sometimes it's scientific, sometimes it's regulatory, sometimes it's cultural. All manner of things happening here. But imagine if you were a company who wanted to create a score for social influence on the internet. So basically a credit score for the internet, but for social influence in the current world. And you write your algorithm and it scrapes Twitter and Facebook and Google+, and it goes looking for who is most retweeted, most followed, most liked, most favorited. And you run all the data through this algorithm. And out pops on the other end Justin Bieber, most influential person on the internet. And you think, or uh-oh, depending on where you sit. And truthfully, I'm sure if you ran that algorithm today, it would be Miley Cyrus, which is a different uh-oh right there. And so then you say, is that really the answer we want? You know, should the most influential person on the internet really be Justin Bieber? So then you go rewrite the algorithm so that the answer pops out Warren Buffett. And then you start to know that the thing about algorithms is they are also about making truths, right? They're about making answers, and they're about making answers that are comforting or comfortable or rearrange the world the way we hope it will be rearranged, which is complicated, right? How we extract value, how we engage in sense-making is also about the stories we want to tell, not necessarily the stories that will be told. And parsing those things is always intensely complicated. And for me, I think it's intensely complicated because right now we are sitting in a moment. I know I'm making you hungry for lunch and it's still not even digesting breakfast here. But there is something about the current generation of algorithms that I find fascinating. If you encounter them, and most of you who are building things that use algorithms, you also encounter them in your daily life beyond your work lives. If you are a user of Amazon, Netflix, Facebook, Google, some of you shop on Amazon, I know you do. Yes. And I know when you come back to Amazon after a slight absence, it says, Bill, you're back. Oh, we found things we know you'll like. And you should buy them. And when you type a search into Google, it automatically populates the rest of your answer. When you go to Netflix, it says, Chris, you're back. No, you like that show. Here are some shows with the same actor in it we think you might like. And if you didn't like that, here's ones by the same director. And if that doesn't work for you, here's ones that are set in the same country, time period, geography, because we kind of know you're going to like stuff. We loosely call that whole category of stuff recommendation engines, right? Recommendation algorithms. And they're extraordinary. I mean, they have in many ways changed most of our lives and driven our consumption patterns in interesting ways. But at the moment, what those algorithms do is they know how to think about the familiar. So they're based on things that you have already done and things that other people like you are doing currently, which means they're all about the familiar. Familiar, 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 familiar. Now think about us as human beings. We really like the familiar. We're deeply seduced by it. We like things that are like other things until we stop liking them. When we suddenly get inexplicably, but not so, bored, and we're desperately cruising around looking for something more interesting. Now, there are lots of industries who know how to take advantage of this. The content television ecosystem, they know this one down cold. Reality TV shows, we've had a lot of them of late. We had ones in which people sang, and then ones in which people danced, and then ones in which people danced and sang. That was excellent. We've had more housewives of more places than you knew there could possibly be. Housewives of New Jersey, Housewives of Orange County, Housewives of Miami, Housewives of Dallas. You just keep thinking, really? Where do you all come from? Except that you know Dallas, Miami, New Jersey. You're like, oh, God. But what was the most popular television show of the summer of 2013, the North American summer? A television show so popular that season 3, episode 1, you could actually see it move the needle on internet traffic on the planet, on a global scale. The night this came out, the pirated versions of it went virally across the entire planet, and the internet ticked up. You could actually see it happen. Was it a reality show? Because it was Game of Thrones. If that's a reality show, we all have other issues. So, because what did the producers of Game of Thrones know? They looked at some of the other narrative-based shows that were starting to be successful, and they said, there might be a window of opportunity here between the housewives and the dancing stars to have a narrative-based drama. And we were all right there. Now, we know we're going to see a whole lot more things like Game of Thrones, much the same way we have now seen more period British dramas like Downton Abbey than you can poke a stick at. If Downton Abbey, then Upstairs, Downstairs should surely be reprised, and a few other things, right? Because what's happening here is we go familiar, 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 a little bit bored, very bored, waiting to be delighted. Oh, look, a different thing. And then we settle back into the pattern of wanting it to be the same again, right? But at the moment, algorithms only know how to deliver the same. More housewives, more dancing stars, no Game of Thrones, no Dexter, no Downton Abbey. So what would it mean to do that, right? Think about every scenario you have heard from people talking about smart mobile devices. You pick up your phone, you come to a new city. I'm here, I'm in Denver, I am a known coffee junkie, though I have not had any coffee in the last 24 hours so that I could speak at normal human speed for you. So when I am done with this talk, I'm going to desperately want coffee. And in the future state, future me would consult my phone, and my phone would say, hey, Genevieve, it's you. There's a Starbucks across the street. You only have to get out of the building if you can work out how, out of the building. And across the street, there'll be a Starbucks. Now, if you're willing to go a little bit further, there's an independent coffee shop here in Denver called Inc. that is much better than Starbucks, and you should probably go there. And take a picture of your coffee and post it on the internet. That's the scenario all of you have heard, right? But what if what my phone said to me instead is, hey, Genevieve, we know you need coffee badly. And there is good coffee here and here. But if you're willing to go 3 blocks in the other direction, there is a piece of art, a public art installation, that will make you weep because it's beautiful. And because we know as human beings that that moment where you see something you weren't expecting, the meal that you ordered on someone's recommendation that was totally not what you expected but was the most extraordinary thing you tasted, or the time when you stood in front of a building or a piece of art or a piece of landscape and realized you'd never seen it before and it was like nothing you'd ever seen before, we all remember those moments. We remember those moments because they move us, they connect to us, they surprise us, they delight us. The challenge is, how do we use technology to help deliver that too, right? How do we not just make it more of the same, but a little bit more of delight and wonder and surprise? So where does that leave us, right? I stated earlier that I thought that big data was basically data plus visualization and analytics and algorithms. But ultimately, technology doesn't make facts. It assists in visualizations and analytics. It runs algorithms. But ultimately, it's not creating those things, we are. Big data starts and ends with human beings. It may go through a series of computational intermediaries, but we are the people who build it, we are the people who make it, we are the people who use it. Which means it's intensely human. We're the ones who will understand it, we're the ones who use it, we're the ones who will misuse it. It's all of those pieces, right? So the challenge for me then is how we acknowledge our humanness in all of this, our impact, our history, our limitations, our possibilities. And if the secret to data, data's secret life is that actually data isn't data, it's human, then the challenge also here is how do we make the most of it? How do we as human beings make the most of the technology, make the most of the possibilities here? And for me, that means we're only limited by 2 things, and neither of them are technical. We're limited by our intellects, and the intellect in this room is extraordinary. And we're limited by our imaginations, and I hope those are boundless. So for me, when I think about what is the potential here, it's extraordinary. It's about how we take the best of ourselves, the best of our capacity to think about the world, make sense of the world, and use it in new and complicated and novel and important ways. Whether it's about the environment, it's about climate change, it's about energy, it's about precision medicine, it's about education systems. The scope and scale here is extraordinary. And the limitations, they're only the ones we impose on it. So with that, I wanted to say thank you.